This will be the last part of the musculoskeletal system lecture, and in this particular section we will be looking into the muscles. If you remember from your basic tissue lecture, you'll know that muscles can be actually categorized into cardiac, smooth and skeletal muscle. For the interest of our lecture, we will be focusing on the skeletal muscle because this is what makes up the musculoskeletal system. And the function of your skeletal muscle is basically to give you a proper defined body shape. It also helps protect internal organs, especially those in your abdominal region where you don't really have any bony structures. And most importantly, it helps or it provides movement to our limbs and appendage. So this particular slide shows you the different characteristic or features of the different types of our muscle. And when we look at the skeletal muscle, you can see that basically it is of a striated appearance. It has a lot of striation or a stripy appearance, and it has fibers that are arranged in a tubular manner. Compared to the other two types of muscle, you can see that your skeletal muscle has multiple nucleuses. So this is why we call it to be multinucleated. And of course it is attached to your skeleton, and that is why it is called a skeletal muscle. And most importantly, this is the only muscle that is voluntary in its actions. Looking into the structure of the muscle basically consists of the fascia, which is the outermost covering. In fact, the fascia covers most of our body organs and tissues. So most books, if you look at the chapter on the muscle, they actually start with the epimysium as the outermost covering of your muscle. So the outermost layer or the overcoat of your muscle is actually called the epimysium. Underlying that, you will find the perimysium, and the perimysium actually helps separate the muscle into various groups of fasciculus. And within the fasciculus, you'll find a lot of these muscle fibers, and these muscle fibers are actually enclosed in a connective tissue known as the endomysium. So your entire structure of the bone is actually anchored to the entire structure of the muscle is actually anchored to the bone via tendons. This is an image of a cross-sectional view of your skeletal muscle, and you can see that the outermost layer of your skeletal muscle is actually made out of the epimysium, a dense irregular connective tissue. And the next layer that you'll find is actually the perimysium, and the perimysium basically are connective tissue that actually extends into the muscle structure and help divide or compartmentalize the muscle tissue into smaller muscle fascicles. Okay, so the perimysium actually surrounds each individual muscle fascicles, and it also fills up the spaces between these muscle fascicles. So if you look at one of the muscle fascicles, you can see it's actually composed of many smaller tubular structures, which are actually your muscle fibers, and each individual muscle fiber is actually surrounded by the endomysium, which is a type of connective tissue. So within the perimysium, epimysium and endomysium, you will find a lot of blood vessels and nerve structures. This is an image that actually shows the cross-sectional view of an individual muscle fascicle. So we've looked at the entire cross-section of a skeletal muscle, but this one here is showing you how a single fascicle looks like in a cross-sectional view. And as you can see, the outermost layer that is covering the muscle fascicle is known as the perimysium. And within the perimysium, within the fascicle, you can see that it is composed of individual muscle fibers. And each muscle fiber is actually surrounded by the connective tissue known as the endomysium. Looking deeper into the muscle, you can see that the individual muscle fiber, or what we know as the cell of the skeletal muscle, would look like in a cross-sectional view. So we've already looked at this one, the entire cross-section of a skeletal muscle. We've also looked at just how a single muscle fascicle bundle will look like. Now let's look at a single muscle fiber instead. So the muscle fiber is basically your cell, and like any other cell, it has all the organelles of a normal cell. So you have the endomysium, which is the outermost connective tissue that is surrounding these individual muscle fibers. Just underneath the endomysium, you will find the sarcolemma. Sarcolemma is basically, it's similar to your plasma membrane, because bear in mind this is a cell. Okay, so like any other cell, it has all the organelles like how it would have. So the sarcolemma is actually the plasma membrane, and then you have the sarcoplasma, which is the cytoplasma of your muscle fiber. And within the cytoplasma or the sarcoplasma of the muscle fiber, you'll find all these tiny red structures. Okay, these are the myofibrils, which is basically the contractile unit of your muscle fiber. Okay, so if you take note of the muscle fiber, you always find that whenever anything is referred to the muscle, they will either have the suffix of sarco or myo. Okay, so when you hear the suffix of myo or sarco, then you know it's something to do with your muscle. This shows you a longitudinal view of the skeletal muscle fiber. We've already seen the cross-sectional view. So if you look at it in a longitudinal view, you can actually see that the individual muscle fibers are actually surrounded by sarcolemma, which is their plasma membrane. And you can also see the presence of multiple nucleuses on a single muscle fiber, and within the cytoplasma of your muscle fiber, you'll find a lot of these small tubular structures, these small tubules, which are actually the myofibril. And the myofibril is basically the contractile unit or the functional unit of your skeletal muscle. So if you look at individual myofibril, you can see that it is actually composed of these repetitive units known as your sarcomeres. Okay, and in the sarcomeres, it is actually made out of the thin and thick filament, which is the actin and myosin, which is primarily responsible for the contraction properties of your skeletal muscle. So if you're interested to know how that happens, you probably need to look it up under the sliding filament model to know how a muscle actually contracts. Okay, so the presence of this I band and A band within the sarcomere is what gives rise to the stripy appearance of your skeleton. Muscle interaction is actually based on the fact that a muscle can only pull, it cannot push. So that's something for you to remember. And the interesting thing is muscles usually work together or they work in opposition, which means what one muscle does, another group of muscle will actually undo the action. So muscles can be categorized based on their functional group as either being a prime mover, which is what we call as an agonist. An agonist muscle is usually what provides the major force to complete a kind of movement. So if you look at the example of your flexion, you will see that biceps are actually the prime movers here, so they are the agonist muscles. And then you have another group known as the antagonist, and antagonist muscles are usually those that actually oppose the action of your agonist. So your tricep is actually an antagonist muscle when it comes to the action of flexing your arm. Okay, so it's not that bad to have an antagonist muscle, because you need antagonist muscle to actually restrict the agonist muscle from overdoing a certain kind of movement, because they provide some resistance towards the movement that is being done. Okay, then you have another group known as the synergies. These are all muscles that help the entire movement, like your brachioradialis here. This is a synergist muscle, and synergist muscles are muscles that actually stabilizes a joint around which the movement is actually occurring. So bear in mind, movements actually takes place at a joint, and here is actually happening at your elbow joint. The flexion of your arms takes place because of the elbow joint that you have, and the brachioradialis muscle is actually a muscle that is actually stabilizing the joint during this movement. And then the final group will be the fixators, which is the deltoid muscle here. A fixator muscle usually, what's the function of it is usually to stabilize the origin of the agonist muscle. So your bicep muscles actually have their point of origin near your shoulder here. So what the fixators do is they stabilize that point of origin during movements. So this one actually shows you the origin and insertion of skeletal muscles. As you know, muscles usually will have an origin and will have an insertion point, and usually the point of origin is fixed. It will not be the one that is moving, but the point of insertion is where the movement is going to take place. So whichever bone that the muscles go and insert into, that is the bone that they are going to actually move. Okay, so for example, if you look at the tricep here, the point of origin is somewhere on your shoulder area, and it actually inserts into your ulnar bone. Okay, so it inserts into the ulnar bone, and your bicep on the other side is inserting into the radial bone over here, and its point of origin is also around your shoulder area. But if you note that the point of insertion always is across a particular joint, so you know that your joint of flexion and extension occurs at your elbow, the joint in your elbow, the insertion point of your bicep and tricep will be in the bones that they cross over the joints to insert into the bone, so that when they contract, they actually cause the pulling action of the particular bone. So in this image, we look at the functional properties of the muscle, the agonist and the antagonist action. So remember that muscles usually they work in pairs lah. Okay, so one will be an agonist and one will be an antagonist. So in our classic example of flexing your arms, the bicep often acts as the agonist, which is going to contract and cause you to close your forearms. As you remember, the point of insertion is actually here, which is the radial bone, so it's going to pull. As muscles contract, fibers will shorten, and this will cause the muscle to pull on the bone, and you actually get to fold your hand. Okay, when that is happening, over in the other side, the opposite side, the triceps are actually relaxed and they act as an antagonist. But when you are going to extend our arms again, when you're opening up your arm, what happens is the triceps will now contract. Okay, so when the tricep contracts, the tricep is actually attaching to the ulnar bone. So when the tricep contracts, it's going to pull against the ulnar bone, so you're going to open up your arms. Okay, and the bicep on the other hand is going to relax. So what happens is the tricep now acts as an agonist and the biceps now acts as an antagonist. So the roles are actually reversed when you are flexing and extending. The roles of the muscles are actually reversed. What was an agonist earlier is now an antagonist, and vice versa. So muscles can actually have a dual role. They can be either agonist or antagonist depending on the type of movement that they are doing. So this one literally looks into the arrangement of fascicles. So if you remember, or if you should know, that all skeletal muscle consists of fascicle, but their arrangement varies, and because of the difference in their arrangement, the size and the shapes and their function is also different. So these are some of the common kind of fascicle arrangement that we have in our body. So we have the circular arrangement, in which the muscle fibers arranged in a concentric ring-like pattern. Okay, you can see it up there. It's like a ring-like pattern. And circular arrangement usually found, this kind of muscles are found at the external body openings that they close by contracting. Okay, so sometimes the general term of this muscle is known as a sphincter, like the ones that you find in your anal canal and all. Okay, that's a sphincter. And then you have the convergent type of muscle, and the convergent muscle is actually a muscle that has a very broad origin. Okay, remember muscles have origin and insertion. So the origin of these muscle is usually broad, and the fascicles actually basically converge. They converge towards a single tendon for insertion. Okay, so usually this type of muscle arrangement is triangular or fan shaped. And then you have the fusiform kind of arrangement. Basically, fusiform means like a spindle shaped. That means something like that. It has a tapered end at both ends. Okay, but the fibers are actually arranged in parallel. They are like a longish kind of arrangement, but they have two ends which they get like it's tapered tool. Okay, and then we have the parallel kind of muscle. These are very long strap like muscles. Okay, they have very long axis. And finally, you also have the pennate form. This group of muscle looks like feathers actually, because penna actually means feather, but the muscle has very short fibers that they actually attach obliquely. So they attach sideways, so oblique. They attach obliquely to a central tendon. So they attach to one common central tendon, which is going to run parallel to the length of the muscle. So when you have the attachment occurring in both sides, then we call it as bipennate. Just one side is unipennate. And when you have multiple of them attaching together into a one single tendon in the middle, then we call that the multipennate. So naming of skeletal muscle is actually very interesting. So muscles, you have about 600 whole skeletal muscle which occur in about 75 pairs or so. So it's literally impossible to remember all the names of this muscle. But muscles are usually named based on certain criteria, like muscle that are named based on their location. Okay, like the temporalis. Temporalis is basically a muscle that overlies your temporal bone. So based on their location, you can name a bone. You can name them based on shapes, like whether they are for example, here is the deltoid, or whether they are trapezius or squamous or something like that. And you can name them based on their size, whether they are really big like maximus, very small minimus, very long longus, or very short brevis. Okay, or you can name them based on their number of origins. You remember their origin, the point of origin. So this is where you get either they have one origin, two origins like bicep, triceps, and quadriceps. So 2 origin, 3 origin, or 4 origins. You can name them based on their action, whether they are a flexor or an extensor or a abductors, or you can name them based on the direction of the muscle fibers, oblique, transverse, or rectus. The quite common or interesting muscles and their names and locations. We can't remember all of them, but we can actually look at a few. And let's start from the top, which is the frontalis. And from the name frontalis, I think you should know that this muscle would probably be named based on its location, and it could be probably lying on the frontal bone of your cranium. So that's why it might be called the frontalis. Then you have your trapezius, which is a very large triangular shaped muscle. And this one is usually found in the posterior, towards the back of your body, and often involved in the movement of your head and shoulders. Then you have your deltoid, which is literally your shoulder muscles. And then the pectoralis major. The pectoralis major is actually a very thick fan-shaped muscle, and it's found on your chest and also usually under the breast. Okay, you will find it on your chest. So that's pectoralis major. And then the tricep and the biceps, which you already know. And we also have the latissimus dorsi, which is the broadest muscle of the back. Okay, when you see the back of your body over here, so the latissimus dorsi is literally the broadest muscle of the back, and also the one of the widest one that we have, which is mostly responsible for our upper body movements. Then you have your abdominal muscle at the abdominal cavity area, and then the gluteus maximus, which is literally your butt. And we also have the sartorius. Sartorius is another interesting muscle. Okay, even though you can see here it's like very thin and slender. Okay, so sartorius is literally the longest muscle in the human body. Okay, it's very long, thick, and it's also quite superficial, and it actually runs throughout your thighs. Okay, so this is the longest muscle we have. And then we have the bicep and femoris and rectus femoris, which are at your upper leg region. And then you have these muscles known as gastrocnemius over here, and these are actually your calves of the leg. Okay, these are the calf muscles of the leg, which they run and join the Achilles tendon. Okay, so the insertion or the tendons that they join to is known as the Achilles tendon. And what's special about Achilles tendon is this is the tendon which is the strongest. So for the last section, we'll just talk about the tendons. Tendons are basically a type of connective tissue. So they are a fibrous type of connective tissue made out of collagens, and they have fibers. These collagen fibers are actually very closely packed, so that it gives them sufficient strength and also to be able to withstand tension during which a movement happens. So tendons, as we know, is the tissues that actually connects your muscles to bones. So that will be the end of this musculoskeletal lecture. I hope you would have understood what has been delivered to you. So if you have any questions, just do get in touch with me and we can discuss further. Thank you.